In May 1741, Captain David Cheap raised his pistol and shot his own midshipman in the face at point-blank range. The dying man begged for medical help, but the captain refused. The crew had already been pushed past their limit, and soon after they marooned their captain on the desolate Patagonian island where they'd been stranded for months. But here's the insane part. When a group of survivors somehow made it back to England years later, they had a collection of stories so outrageously depraved and unprecedented, the Navy didn't know how to handle them. So they looked at the whole disaster and basically said, let's just pretend none of this happened. This is the story of the disturbing events that unfolded during the crew's time shipwrecked on that deserted island. Events so disgraceful and unthinkable, the British Empire tried to erase them from history. The year is 1740. Britain is at war with Spain in what they called the War of Jenkins' Ear. Yes, literally named after a captain's severed ear. The British Admiralty has ambitious plans to attack Spanish interests in the Pacific, and they assemble a squadron of warships under Commodore George Anson. Among these was the HMS Wager, not a proper warship, but a converted merchant vessel, hastily outfitted with cannons and crammed with a desperate, ragtag crew. With Britain scrambling for sailors, press gangs, Navy recruiters who seized men by force swept the streets, jails and poorhouses. Some of those taken were elderly, some missing limbs, others deathly ill. But the Empire needed bodies, and bodies it got. And commanding this floating disaster, a man who'd never captained a large ship before, the ill-tempered Lieutenant David Cheap, promoted only after the original captain died en route. They departed England in September 1740, a squadron of 8 vessels carrying nearly 1,900 men. But rounding Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America would test them beyond imagination. Hurricane-force winds hammering the ships for weeks on end. Waves taller than 3-story buildings crashed over the bow. The temperature dropped so low that ice formed on the rigging while men tried to work it with frostbitten fingers. And below decks lived a hellscape of disease. Scurvy was ravaging the crew. Not just weakness and fatigue, but teeth falling out mid-sentence, old wounds spontaneously reopening, men literally rotting alive. Typhus spread through the cramped, filthy quarters. By the time they approached the treacherous maze of islands off the Chilean coast, half the crew was either dead or too sick to stand. But here's where things get interesting. The HMS Wager became separated from the rest of the squadron. Lost, alone, and with navigation equipment that was primitive by today's standards, they faced a critical decision. The ship's gunner, John Bulkley, possibly the most competent sailor on board, argued they should head for the squadron's rendezvous point at Juan Fernandez Island. Captain Cheap, however, insisted on a different course towards Socorro Island, closer to the mainland. But what neither man knew was that they had already sailed into catastrophe. On May 13th, 1741, the ship's carpenter glimpsed land through the fog, but the lieutenant on watch dismissed it. By the time they realised that they'd drifted into an uncharted bay, it was too late. And in a twist worthy of a Greek tragedy, during the frantic attempts to save the ship, Captain Cheap fell down a ladder, dislocating his shoulder and leaving him bedridden while his vessel drove straight toward the rocks. Have you ever wondered what happens when the chain of command simply dissolves? When the very foundations of military discipline collapse? The survivors of the Wager were about to find out, and what they discovered would shock even the hardened Admiralty back in London. The Wager slammed into the rocky coast of what would later be called Wager Island, a desolate, windswept scrap of land in the middle of a Patagonian winter. Of the original crew, about 140 made it to shore alive. But here's where naval tradition collided with brutal reality. In the Royal Navy of 1741, an officer's commission was valid only for the specific ship to which he was assigned. When the Wager broke apart on those rocks, technically, so did Captain Cheap's authority. The survivors found themselves in a legal grey area, unlike anything in naval history. Some crew members immediately broke into the ship's spirit room, got blind drunk, and began looting. They dressed in officers' uniforms, fought each other, and several drowned when the ship finally broke apart completely the next day. On shore, conditions were nightmarish. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Food was scarce. Men scraped seaweed off rocks and hunted for shellfish in the freezing water. The survivors had salvaged some supplies, but Captain Cheap kept them in his tent, rationing them with an iron fist. Tensions exploded when a group of sailors were caught stealing food. The crew was already starving, reduced to eating scraps of seal meat, rotting fish, even strips of leather, so the theft was more desperation than rebellion. But Captain Cheap saw it as a threat to his authority. He ordered 600 lashes to be carried out, a punishment that, even divided among several men, was brutal enough to kill a healthy sailor. It wasn't just the number, it was the process. The lashes were administered over the course of multiple days, in drawn-out sessions meant to maximise pain and humiliation. Each man would be tied down and whipped with a heavy, knotted rope designed to tear flesh. With their bodies already emaciated and immune systems wrecked by hunger and exposure, some of the men passed out mid-flogging. Others developed infections from the open wounds. A few never fully recovered. In the Royal Navy, flogging was harsh but routine. This went far beyond that. This was ritual punishment. Discipline turned into psychological warfare. And the men watching knew if they stepped out of line, they could be next. But the true breaking point came soon after, when Captain Cheap, in a fit of rage, shot Midshipman Henry Cousins point blank in the face, allegedly for dereliction of duty. Cousins was unarmed and possibly retreating. He didn't die right away. He suffered for 10 days while Cheap refused to allow medical aid. And after a week and a half of unimaginable pain, Cousins died. The lines between discipline and cruelty, between authority and tyranny, had not just blurred, they'd vanished entirely. For weeks, these men had clung to the edges of existence. They'd watched their shipmates die of scurvy, drown in the wreck, and now face execution by their own captain. In their minds, they weren't mutineers. They were men fighting for their lives, against a system that had already abandoned them. What happened next was remarkable. The survivors spent months lengthening the ship's longboat, turning it into a makeshift schooner they named Speedwell. Meanwhile, gunner John Bulkley was meticulously documenting everything in his journal, knowing that if they ever made it back to England, there would be consequences. In October 1741, 5 months after the wreck, 81 men under Bulkley's leadership stormed Captain Cheap's quarters, arrested him for murder, and left him on the island with just 19 loyal men. They set sail for Brazil, a journey of 2,500 nautical miles through some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. By the time they reached Brazil, in January 1742, only 29 of the 81 men were still alive. They'd faced starvation, dehydration, and storms so violent they tore their makeshift sails to shreds. Some accounts even suggest that, in their desperation, a few resorted to cannibalism. Meanwhile, back on Wager Island, something extraordinary happened. A group of indigenous Kawascar people in canoes discovered Captain Cheap and his remaining men. Despite European sailors traditionally viewing indigenous people as savages, these Kawascar, led by a chieftain named Martin Oleta, saved the British castaways from certain death. Oleta guided Cheap's group through an inland route across the Taitao Peninsula, a journey so arduous that only 3 men, including Captain Cheap and young midshipman John Byron, who would later become the grandfather of the famous poet Lord Byron, survived to reach Spanish territory. When both groups of survivors eventually made it back to England, Bulkley's mutineers first, then Captain Cheap and his loyal few 2 years later, the Admiralty faced an unprecedented dilemma. The court-martial that followed was the naval equivalent of opening Pandora's box. If they punished Bulkley and his men for mutiny, they'd have to acknowledge that Captain Cheap had murdered Midshipman Cousins. If they court-martialed Cheap, they'd be undermining the very foundation of naval authority. Their solution? The most spectacular legal sleight of hand in naval history. They focused the entire trial on the technical question of who was responsible for the Wager hitting the rocks in the first place. Lieutenant Baines, who had failed to report the initial land sighting, received a minor reprimand. Everyone else, both the captain, who shot his own officer, and the men who mutinied against him, walked free. It was as if the Admiralty had collectively decided, this disaster is too embarrassing, too messy to formally acknowledge. But the story wasn't over. George Anson, the commander of the original expedition, was so disturbed by the Wager incident that he pushed through an Act of Parliament in 1748 that fundamentally changed naval law. From that point forward, a ship's officers would retain authority over their crew, even if their vessel was lost or wrecked. The survivors took wildly different paths. Captain Cheap was promoted to command a 40-gun ship called the Lark, capturing valuable prizes before dying in 1752. John Byron rose to become a vice-admiral, circumnavigated the globe, and passed down stories of his ordeal to his grandson, the poet Lord Byron, who incorporated elements of the Wager disaster into his epic poem Don Juan. John Bulkeley, the gunner who led the mutiny, declined command of a ship called the Royal George, which later sank with all its crew, then emigrated to Pennsylvania, where his account was republished in 1757. After that, he vanishes from historical record. The wreck itself remained hidden until 2006, when an expedition uncovered fragments of the Wager's hull buried in sand. In the centuries since the disaster, tectonic activity had lifted parts of the island by over 20 feet, with 94 recorded earthquakes, including one during the castaways' time there. The inlet near where the crew once camped is now an inland lake, cut off from the sea. But now the silence is broken, and what remains is a chilling reminder of what humans become when the rules vanish, and survival is all that's left.